Hey everybody, welcome to Unscripted, where we are all about inspiring better conversations and thinking more deeply and critically about faith, life, and leadership. My name is Sam, and I'm here with my good and fairly new friend, Ben Korinek. I'm so glad that you're here, first and foremost. Thank you for coming.
I'm glad to be here, man. This is awesome.
It's so good. I mean, we've known each other for only like a few months now.
Yeah.
However, we've lived parallel lives.
Yeah.
So for a number of reasons, I'm going to give a little background.
That's great.
First and foremost, you are a teaching pastor at Christ the Rock Church in Menasha.
That's correct.
Awesome. It's an awesome church, not too far from here. You guys have this beautiful building, an awesome group of people. I've been up there for a couple of different things, like there are a couple of events that I was up there for a number of years ago.
Yeah.
It's an awesome place. You guys do such good work.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Yeah, you bet. But back to the parallel lives thing. Mm-hmm. What's funny is I think we're similar ages, maybe the same age. We have 3 boys.
Yes.
Married to high school sweethearts.
And all 3 boys are the same ages.
Same ages by within a month.
Yeah.
It's insane.
It's crazy.
So we've been literally living parallel lives, but we met each other not in Wisconsin, even though we both live here in Wisconsin, about 45 minutes away from each other.
Yeah.
So you want to tell them where we met?
Absolutely, man. And it's good to see that I don't make you as nervous as Meg makes you.
Oh gosh, thanks for watching that one.
Yeah,
that was awkward.
So
she's gonna come back at some point, and I'm gonna try and dial down the nerves.
That's great, man. Yeah, no. I feel like we're both comfortable with each other, so that's a good thing. So so Sam and I, it was really cool because you and I got to meet in Phoenix actually, because we're part of this same cohort of pastors from around the country who are just learning communication and how we can be better communicators, but we're learning from one another, which is the cool thing.
It really is.
And I'm looking on the list of the different guys who are there, guys from Colorado, from Florida, from Texas, and then there's a guy from Ripon. Yeah, hey guys. And then there's this guy from Ripon, Wisconsin. I'm like, he lives a half an hour away from me. What in the world? And so I emailed you and just said, hey man, we live really close. And, timing wise, it was like, well, we'll see each other out in Phoenix. Yeah. And so the first time we met was in Phoenix, though we live a half an hour away from each other.
Yeah, totally. And then now we've gotten to chat a couple times. And it's awesome. So what I was so excited about to have you on the podcast for a number of reasons. One, you're a wealth of knowledge and you're super smart, and it's really evident when you sit and chat with you that you really care about people, but you also care about things being true and good.
Yeah.
And it really comes through, and I haven't gotten to review your teaching. You haven't reviewed mine yet, but that'll be fun when we get to that point.
Yeah.
But I've watched just little bits of your speaking, and it's awesome because you have this authority about you where you know what you're talking about, and you've done your research, and you can tell that this is really good stuff. So I love that, and I'm excited for your church and your leadership there.
Thanks, man.
And you've been there for really quick. You've been there for a year and a half.
Almost 2 years now.
Okay.
So I came in September of 2019.
Great time to start something new.
Yeah, because just as usually kind of rule of thumb is if you're starting a new role anywhere, it's probably going to take about 6 months to really get acclimated.
Sure.
But in a church, it can, depending on the church and the culture and all these different things, it could take, for some people, it could take maybe 3 months where they start to feel really acclimated. It could take a year. And so at Christ the Rock, I was just starting to feel as if I was getting into the swing of things. Yeah. And then COVID hits.
Totally.
And so in some ways, it was really good because we got to throw the playbook out the window in a lot of ways. So there was a pressure I was sort of feeling to measure up to a certain kind of degree of standard based on previous speakers that they had, known in that pulpit. But then I was able to sort of remold the whole thing, like what our teaching ministry looks like and what it is. But then at the same time, there's people who are saying, hey, are you feeling connected at the church yet? And I'm going, well, I'm feeling about 10 months behind.
Yeah.
And it usually takes someone maybe a few seconds to go, why does he? Oh, because of COVID. And I'm like, yes.
The thing that's fascinating about that is, as a speaking pastor, your primary role is to speak to people.
Yeah.
And when you speak to people, it's rarely, through a camera is a very difficult thing to do. It's exponentially more difficult to connect with someone through a camera than it is in person. Because when you're in a room, you can feel the room, you can see the emotions on people's faces, you can decide if you're connecting, if you want to switch routes. There's so many things that go into that. Absolutely. So you've had a really crazy learning curve at that place.
Yeah.
How has it been being in person and speaking that way?
Well, it's been really good. So I don't have a problem speaking to a camera, because I feel like there's a different way you can use that medium, that you can still connect with people, and in some ways it can feel personal because you're in their living room with them. So it's sort of this weird thing, but it's not personal for me. For me, I'm looking at a camera and talking to them. So the biofeedback is what I miss. Like when you're in a room with people, there are those moments where you say something and you don't mean it to be funny, but everyone laughs and you realize, oh yeah, like I get why you thought that was funny. Or you say something that you mean to be funny and no one laughs. And then you have to have that moment where you're like, that was supposed to be a joke, everybody. And, so there's these moments where you get to interact with the congregation or the audience in a different way. And so I did miss that. So being back has been really good, but we still do a lot of communication with the cameras. And so like I'll do these devotions that we put on YouTube and Facebook.
Yeah.
And even on Sundays, like we're trying to learn that balance between what it means to keep eye contact with the camera, but then also to actually have eye contact with people in the room.
Yeah.
And it's a whole new world, man. It's a whole new world.
It is, and nothing's going to be exactly the same as it was pre-COVID, and we're all kind of figuring that out, and how to stay connected with people, and and for people that aren't in person, to help them feel connected as well.
Totally, man.
Speaking of connection, and this is really the biggest reason I was super excited to have you on here. You do a podcast yourself called This Divine Moment. It's pretty new, right?
Yeah. I'm 12 episodes in.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This Divine Moment with Ben Korinek. You can look it up.
That's it.
It's awesome. I listened to an episode or two. It's really fun.
Oh, thanks, man. I really appreciate that.
But what I love is it's such a perfect picture of your life. So while we were in Phoenix, we kind of shared some history and background of our lives. And you have a pretty wild story, to say the least. And we don't have time to do the whole thing.
Yeah.
But there are a few things that I thought was just incredible. And I think it really speaks to how you interact with people and what I think is a big passion of yours, I think. So you have to tell me if I'm right about this or not. There's a number of moments, but there's a couple of specific ones that in your story where you basically had to live with other people, like really at a really young age. You were trying to kind of get by at a really vulnerable young point of your life.
Yeah.
And there were a couple people that just jumped into your life in these moments, and they're like divine moments.
Totally.
And they said the right thing. They did the right thing.
Yeah.
And it literally changed the course of your life.
Absolutely.
And there's one of those things. There's the guy that you lived with, and you paid rent, and he just like would feed you books. Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I'll back up just a little bit so that listeners kind of understand like where that all started.
Please.
I was living with my mother, and we had this season where she didn't have income, and then there, like my dad kind of came into the picture for a little bit. I think he was trying to help out. He was really absent in my childhood, so it was interesting that in that time in my life, it felt like he was trying really hard to be like, how can I be a dad? So it was good in that sense, but then both of them didn't have jobs, and so then like we got evicted out of this house that we were living in.
Yeah, and
in that time, my dad just went and lived with a friend, and my mom went and lived with a family member, and they both said, "Hey, look, we can't take care of you anymore." Yeah. And I was a junior in high school, and I just remember that feeling of going, "Oh, like this, it's on me. Like I'm alone. I got to figure this out." Yeah. And so I felt really alone. And I felt abandoned, and I was, in a sense. Like, both my parents said, hey, we can't take care of you anymore. And there's no other family members who were like, hey, like, we'll step up to the plate. Aunts, uncles, grandparents, nobody else was like, hey, let us take you in. So for a few weeks, I stayed with a family from the church, but I knew that I couldn't stay there long term. I mean, this wasn't a permanent solution. I was just sleeping on a random bed in their house, and they were kind of like, I could tell there was this sort of like, hey, when are you going to get out of here? And so I had to find a place to live. And yet I felt like everything was on my shoulders. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what am I going to do? And then I was reading the Psalms, and I love the Psalms. I try to read Psalms every single day. And Psalm 27, verse 10 says, even when my mother and my father forsake me, Lord, you'll receive me.
Yeah.
And that verse just jumped off the page at me. And I just remember going, okay, so God is going to take care of me. Even when my mom and my dad won't take care of me, God will.
Yeah.
So I just put my faith in him. And, you know, at this point, I was already a Christian. I'd been a Christian for about 2 years at this point. And so I went, okay, I think this is one of those moments where you really put feet to your faith and you say, okay, God, you're going to do it. And so I just said verbally, like, God, I trust you. And something shifted in my heart, and the sense of anxiety that I'd been carrying was just not as palpable. And then was asking friends, like, hey, does anyone know of a place I can live? And this one guy was like, yeah, my dad said to give him a call. And so the situation there was that this was a friend of mine who his parents had been divorced, and he was living with his mom, but his dad had this house. And so he's like, yeah, my dad heard about your situation, and he told me to tell you to give him a call. Okay. So I call him up. His name's Dan. And Dan goes, yeah. So I don't know why I do this. It's like phones don't look like this
No,
anymore. I'm like, I should just do this. Like, I call Dan up, and so I called Dan, and he said, hey, I've got a room that you can rent in my house, and it'll include some utilities. But yeah, if that's interesting to you, then you can take that offer.
Yeah.
And it was my only offer. It was the only place I had to live, and it was the only place I could afford. It was just renting a bedroom in this house. So in my mind, it was like an economic decision. Like, okay, I'm going to go live with this guy, and he's Christian, so that's cool. Well, then when I'm living in his house, he told me about the story of their divorce and all this stuff, and about how essentially he'd just been living selfishly, and it was like really he owned that whole season of his life. And then he said, so the past like decade was just him reading these books and spending time with different Christian men and learning how to really become the man that God had called him to be. And so then here's me at, junior in high school. I guess by that time I moved in, I was just moving into my senior year. And I have no clue. I have no idea what's going on in life. And so he's just like, hey, you need to read this book, Wild at Heart. It'll teach you what it means to have the heart of a man. You need to read this book by Dr. Henry Cloud. It'll teach you how to set up boundaries in your life and how to deal with difficult people. And so he just kept giving me all these books, and it felt almost a little bit like I was like not offended, but I was like, oh, okay, so you don't think like I've got things together? And he'd just be like, you don't. you're this young punk. Like he's like,
you need this.
And then but he kept saying to me, I figured this stuff out in my 40s. You can figure it out now.
What a really wise thing to say.
Yeah. And he's like, so I'm trying to save you 20 plus years of pain that I went through because I didn't get a hold of this kind of information until I was, in my young 40s.
And those are some seriously legit books to give to a 20-something or whatever.
Yeah.
19
Well, at the time I was 18. And so he's having me read these books, and I think it set my life on a course where had I not interacted with this guy, had I not encountered him and lived in his house, and had he not given me these books to read, and not that books are everything, but I think for me in that season of my life, because it wasn't just the books, there'd be like, I'd finish the book and he'd say, what do you think of it?
Yeah.
And he'd have these moments where he'd just sit down with me at a table and kind of drill me with questions, and it would help me to think even more like, okay, how do I actually apply this then? Not just getting the knowledge, but how do I apply it? And I feel like that was a life-changing, divine season in my life.
There's lots of questions off of that. The first question is this. Do you still know him and talk with him?
Absolutely. Yeah, so our relationship is sort of where he'll text me or call me every once in a while, and we'll just catch up. He lives in Florida now. And so he's like, hey, next time you're in Florida, come on by. Like, you can stay at my place. I'm like, I will definitely find a way to get down there. And but he'll just text me, and he'll ask me how I'm doing, how things are going. But every single time he texts me, he just reminds me of my calling. And he reminds me, he'll just say, Ben, keep your eyes focused on your calling, continue to be a man after God's heart, be the leader in your home. Like he'll say all these encouraging things, and it feels a little bit like a Paul Timothy type thing. Like he'll send me these encouragements, and it feels like it's an excerpt right out of one of Paul's letters to Timothy.
That's really, really neat.
Yeah.
So you know him still, that's still there. That's really incredible. Mm-hmm. But the thing that has really stood out to me is that moment, and you said it, shifted your life dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely.
How's that changed the way you view your interactions with other people?
Sam, that's a good question. Yeah, I would say that for me, I think it causes me to look for moments where I can pour into somebody.
Yeah.
And I think he taught me that in a really practical way, because you hear people say things like that, like, yeah, you got to pour into people. And
yeah, what does that even mean?
What does that even mean?
Yeah.
And like all those Christianese terms that we use in churches. And so I feel like for me, it was just one of those moments where I got to see a practical way you could do that, of just like looking where someone's at and being like, hey, read this book, or just even finding out how you can meet a practical need. Yeah. And so like, because what he did, it was like multiple layers deep. It's like he met a practical need. He was there as sort of a mentor in my life, but he wasn't like overbearing. He would just offer things and suggest things. Then there is the idea of giving somebody a book to read, or just a resource. It might be a podcast to listen to, like Unscripted.
Yeah, or This Divine Moment.
Yeah, This Divine Moment. But honestly, like I listen to a ton of podcasts, and so sometimes someone's talking to me, and I'm like, no, there's a specific episode of a podcast I was listening to, and just the other day I sent a guy a link to a podcast, and he texted me back a couple days later and was like, honestly, that was super helpful for me, completely relevant to exactly where I'm at. So I love to find ways that I can put a resource into someone's hand and help them, take the next step in their journey. And I think the other thing that he taught me is just the value of keeping connected. So like it doesn't have to be hey, every week, Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., it can just be hey man, you're on my mind. I'm thinking about you, praying for you. Hope you're doing well. Like, sending a text message like that when someone comes to your mind. And so I feel like I learned quite a few really easy practices to put into place to help connect with and just help other people.
Yeah, that's really awesome. It makes me think, I was just reading an article not that long ago about loneliness.
Yeah.
And how in the COVID world and then post-COVID world, and I think it's probably more so just uncovered a symptom that was always there.
Yeah.
This loneliness thing. And you talk about connection.
Mm-hmm.
I think as Christians, we often have this idea, if you follow Jesus, that like you should have this kind of perfect life, like everything's kind of buttoned up and looking good and feeling good. And that's just not the case, right? You don't get that. That's not available in the way that sometimes we imagine it to be.
Yeah.
And I think what you said through what you're talking about, the various levels of things that he provided for you, Dan, right?
Yeah.
That Dan provided for you. That's just all these really practical ways to be in a community with somebody, to be a friend to somebody. And what I love about what you said is it's not just this, I'm going to fix it for you, I'm going to be right there in your face and forcing you to do things. It's this gentle, consistent, and constant presence that somebody has there. And so for me, like it's a really encouraging picture of what like discipleship should really look like, because it's not this regimented, overarchingly programmed thing. It's this lifestyle thing.
Yeah.
I don't know, what do you think about that?
I actually agree with that a ton, because you just, as you were saying that, it jogged my memory a little bit. And I remember every morning I'd wake up and he'd already be sitting in this one chair where he'd be reading his Bible. And so I'd come out of my bedroom and he just just even by setting that example, he was already awake, seeking God first thing. And in my mind, I'm like, man, why would I don't want to get up that early.
Yeah.
But then I started thinking, well, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I get up earlier? Why don't I go to bed earlier and get up earlier? Because he'd always go to bed at like 9:30 at night and get up at like 5 in the morning. Yeah. I'm like, man, what a loser. But it's like, no, honestly, this guy, he had his priorities straight. He had his values in place. And so I think that you can do those practical things in a discipleship relationship. Because really the word disciple means student. It's like a learner. So Jesus was this rabbi and he had these disciples, and today we might say like teacher and students. So they were trying to learn from him. And yet there's these really practical things that you can do on a daily or regular basis with someone to help foster that relationship. And, because a 21st century American culture and the way we do relationships is going to look different than first century Palestine.
Totally.
But at the same time, what Dan did is he showed me a practical way that could work, but then a lot of it was also just through the example of his lifestyle. Like I was watching, and I don't know that he really thought about that a lot, but I
love
was paying
that
attention.
I love that phrase. He was watching.
Yeah.
You were watching.
I was
right?
watching.
You were watching. I don't think we ever realized just how much people are watching.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we take it for granted, or we just lose sight of it altogether.
Yeah.
And I think the most significant form of leadership we can have is our example.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And it actually brings us back to the divine moment thing, like these moments where like wild things happen, or just somebody says the right thing at the right time, or you see something play out and it hits something in your brain and you just can't help it. How have you begun to look for those things?
Oh man, that's a great question. So, like looking for divine moments?
Yeah, because I mean, the previous question was kind of what you learned from being a person to someone else, but at the same point, we can still be growing and learning from other people and from the circumstances that we find ourselves in. If we look through God's lens of like how we see this world, it changes our view of things.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not something that happens overnight. Like to be able to see things through God's lens, it's going to take a long time, because essentially we've all been trained to see things through our own lens for a long time, or someone else's lens. So for me to be able to say, okay, like there is a different lens I've got to look through. It's going to take time to hone that and filter that and think through that. And so I think for me, it's just been this journey of going, I mean, I guess to be able to know how to look through the lens of how God sees the world, it means I have to know God better.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so for me, like God's word is such a great way to be able to do that, because sometimes you can hear the impression of God's Spirit speaking to you. So you get this thought in your mind and you go, oh, is that me or is that God? The best way to know, to filter that and test that, is to know the written word of God.
Exactly.
Like he's already given us his heart and his mind in the pages of Scripture. So for me to be able to read Scripture and go, okay, this is what God thinks about this, or this is how God, this is like his thoughts towards us. And so God isn't going to tell me to do something that's harmful to myself, because God cares about me and he wants me to prosper and to do better. But when he says prosper, it doesn't necessarily mean he needs me to be rich.
No,
he wants me to be doing well in life, like to live a healthy, centered life where I'm continuing to learn and grow from him. So for me, that's a big part of it. And then I just think there's these moments where it's not so much that we have to be looking for God to be at work, because it's not like a rainbow where it happens every once in a while and then we miss it, or like a sunset, like there's really like those just few minutes where the sun's going down and you're like, oh, I got to catch it. God's at work all the time.
Yeah.
All around us. Like he's way more at work than we even realize. So to me, it's almost more like when you get a certain car, like you buy a Toyota, and you get a Toyota RAV4, and now all you see on the road is Toyota RAV4s.
I gave this reference. We
Really?
talked about this in a sermon recently.
Oh, that's funny.
Because I literally just bought a Toyota Sienna, which,
Oh,
van
that's
life,
great.
awesome.
Woo! Yeah, man, you're moving on up.
But we look at it everywhere. Like
Mhm.
I joked with my wife the other day, like I point out Siennas all the time.
Yeah.
And I wish it was like, I wish I had talked about it in the sermon where you said whenever you saw one, you should do like the slug bug, like where you see a bug and you hit somebody.
Yeah.
Wish I had done that, because I think that would have been hilarious.
Yeah.
Because now everybody, when they see Siennas, they'd hit somebody.
That's true.
But anyways, go on.
Yeah. So you're wanting to incite violence.
Yes, that's exactly
great,
my plan.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
what we need more of
appreciate
that in Ripon. I
Very
think.
much
That's,
so.
So for me, but that's totally the point though. Like it's exactly that. Now you see Siennas everywhere, where before you didn't ever notice Siennas.
Definitely.
And so for me, that's the whole like filter of learning what it means to look for divine moments. Is there's moments that crash through in your life where you go, this is totally a divine moment. And now you've got a framework. Now you're starting to go, okay, this is when God's at work. And we think it's going to be angels showing up and trumpets and, like giant light. And often it's in these really simple, quiet little moments where something happens, like something between you and your kid, or some way that like someone serves you in a way that really impacts your heart. And you just go, like talking about Dan.
Yeah.
Dan giving me a book. I mean, that's like a really mundane thing, but it was actually completely divine.
Yeah.
And so there's these things where something's happening and you realize it's a divine moment. And now you've got another filter, another thing to think through to say, okay, so God's actually way more at work than I originally thought and realized. And now it's starting to get to the point in my life where I just see God at work all the time.
Yeah.
And it's almost laughable because I'm like, oh, I think God's at work right now. And then it's sort of like this, like, well, of course he is. Like, that's what he does.
All the time.
All the time.
Yes.
So it's more us becoming aware of it. And that's why I love sharing that story out of the scriptures of Jacob when he has the dream.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And so like there's like the Jacob's ladder dream. And then he wakes up. And do you remember what he says?
He says, I can't believe it. God was here and I didn't even know it.
Yeah. I wasn't even aware of it.
Yeah.
I didn't even know it. And to me, that I think is the essence of when God's at work, because there's so many times where he is at work and we're just not aware of it. And then once you become more aware of it, you start to look back and you start to see all the Toyota Siennas in your life.
They're everywhere.
You just start to go, oh man, my whole life has been filled with all these Toyota Siennas. You just see all these divine moments in your life. So
my wife's gonna hate this because we were both in the place where, like, we don't want to buy a van, but we need to buy a van.
Yeah.
Like, it's just been a thing now. But anyways,
dude, well let me say this, that for the longest time we were like an SUV family.
Totally.
We're never getting a minivan.
We're in the same boat.
And then we got
did
a Nissan Quest, which was a cool minivan. But
is there such a thing?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Take your word
it's
for it.
I mean, literally, it's a cool looking minivan
Yeah.
in my humble opinion. But then my wife was like, I've got to get a Honda Odyssey. I don't know what it is about Honda Odysseys, but she was like, I've got to get one.
The cameraman has a Honda Odyssey.
Yeah, man, that's what I'm talking about.
Danny, thank you.
So I love that. So then, long story short, we got the Honda Odyssey finally, and I don't think we'll ever go back. Like, even once the kids are out of the house. Just the other day, I had to haul something.
Yep.
I was like, well, I don't have a pickup truck.
It's an enclosed truck.
Yeah, well, so my brother-in-law goes, you've got more cubic space if you put all your seats down than I do in the back bed of my truck, because he does have, like, the enclosed cab.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, you're right. So I took some of these like old nasty blankets we had, threw them down over the seats that I'd put down, and hauled all this junk, and it was awesome. Like,
there you go, man.
So anyway, man, you guys are gonna come to love it.
We already do.
Yeah. So
I love it.
This podcast sponsored by Toyota.
And Honda.
Yeah, and Honda.
Which car prices are through the roof right now, so that would be great.
That's
some kind of
true.
sponsorship. Anyways.
Yeah, that's right, man. Yeah, we're getting you hooked up.
Anyways, oh man, there's so much here. We have just a little bit more time, so I want to finish with just a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I could go so many directions, but I think the thing that I really want to focus on is part of the last thing you said, the last thing you kind of alluded to, is you talked about how you've just become more and more aware of it over time. Are there any specific practices, things you do, things you say, things you repeat to yourself, things you put on a wall somewhere, I don't know, where it has helped you to become more aware over time? Like, it's just really practical sort of things.
Yeah, I could give you just a handful.
Yeah.
So one of the really practical things that I do that I think is really helpful, and here's what's really interesting. I have someone who listens to my podcast, and he's not necessarily a believer.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to talk with me recently, and he reached out. I said, yeah, I'd be more than willing to talk. And he pretty much was like, a lot of things you say, people could just do, like mindfulness practices,
Sure.
and it would just make them more aware of all sorts of things. So how are you so sure that God's at work? I'm like, well, that's the whole point of faith, man. Like, at a certain point, you have to be sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not yet see. Like, that's what the Bible says faith is. And so everything I'm sharing actually comes, like, some people would say, oh, this comes from the world of mindfulness or psychology. I'm like, actually, if you study monastic traditions,
Which are a tradition of people that follow Jesus in this, like, very particular way.
Yeah, very particular way. Like it's kind of like you sort of picture the monks like off in some place in the desert, and they're all living this life of prayer. Well, it actually goes further back than that. Like, even into groups of Christians who they were very present in their communities. They weren't off in the desert, but they were just holding each other accountable in these spiritual disciplines, these practices that really help them stay connected to God. And so one of those for me is just this practice of solitude.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's getting away from all the noise. It's getting away from all the stuff of life. And I don't get to do it all the time, but it's something I literally schedule in. I'm like, this is going to be solitude time. And I go and I just be with God. And so I'll bring my Bible. And for me, here's what's interesting about it. Some people are like that sounds like the worst thing ever to them. It's just like being by themselves in silence somewhere. So for me, I'm like, I don't make it like terrible. Like I'll go find a lake somewhere because I love being by the water.
Sure.
So yeah. I'll go sit next to a lake, or I'll walk by a lake or something like that. And then I bring my Bible and I'll read the Psalms or something. And for me, I kind of use this analogy where sometimes you need to just be still and silent to see what's going on in your heart.
Yeah.
And I think of it like this, like if you were to drop your keys, like say you're fishing or something, you accidentally drop your car keys in the creek. And so natural reaction is you dive for them immediately. Like you try to like get them up as quick as you can. But then let's say you kick up all the sediment that's at the bottom of the creek. And now the water's cloudy and you can't see anything. Your best bet at that point is to just sit and be still and wait for all the sediment to settle back down to the bottom. And now you can see the keys completely clear. Like you can just reach right in and grab them. And I think sometimes we have to do that with our own hearts.
That's a beautiful metaphor.
Yeah.
Beautiful picture.
Well, man, I'm glad that helps, because for me, that's what solitude does. It's like this, there's so much getting kicked up in my life on a daily basis. And sometimes I've got my calendar set for the day and I'm like, man, this is going to be a great day.
Yeah.
And then just interruption after interruption, things happen. I'm sure you never have this happen, Sam.
Never, ever, all the time.
Because you're a productivity guru. No, so like it's just like even when I've got my day, like I'm just like, that's going to be a great day. I'm going to get all this studying done. Everything's going to be perfectly done. I get to the end of the day and I'm like, man, I just feel as if like it was just craziness and insanity. So anyways, I have all those days. Solitude helps bring all the sediment back down. And it's just like, I'm just able to settle down, be still, and all of a sudden I can see everything much more clearly. And so for me, that's a great practice. Journaling has been a good practice to kind of go with that, because sometimes journaling is what helps me to see what's actually going on inside.
Yeah.
Like I'll write it down and all of a sudden I'll be like, wow, I didn't even know I felt that way.
Definitely.
So I don't know if you've ever done that before.
I've had that happen plenty of times. I used to write a lot more. It's been the third baby thing, like that third kid, dude, just rocked the boat of like predictable time to do things.
Yep.
But we're getting back to there.
Absolutely.
It's a real thing.
Well, and even on that note, like I used to write in a physical journal.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, it felt cooler. Like
I prefer it still. I can't do the tech thing because
I preferred it too, and I would get moleskins because then I felt like Ernest Hemingway, and you know, I was just
like 2 steps removed, man. You're so
close. Exactly. So, but then for me, I was just like, I've got to be able to capture this in the moment.
Yeah.
And sometimes my journal wouldn't be with me, or I wouldn't have that scheduled time.
Yeah.
So I've been using Evernote.
Yeah.
And totally. Evernote for me has been this incredible tool. And it took me a while to get used to just like pulling out my phone and journaling this way.
Yeah.
But now I'm to the point where I love it, because literally in the moment, sometimes I've got like 10 minutes between 2 meetings and I'm like, something's going on in me right now and I need to capture it.
Yeah.
And so I'll just sit down in my office for, 5 minutes, write that note. And then, so like that has been, so I think with all these practices, you have to find ways to make it accessible in your life.
So true.
If the only thing in your mind is like, okay, I can do this stuff if I can drive to the UP and get up by pictured rocks or something, and then
speaking my language right now. It's the best place in the world.
It is, man. I'm taking my son there in a few days.
Oh man, I'm jealous.
It's going to be awesome. So for me, like I have to find ways to bring it down to earth. I have to find ways to just be able to put it in my schedule and say, the easiest way I can get to this, and not to be lazy about it, but to say the more hindrances you put in the way, the less likely you're going to actually do it.
It's absolutely true.
And so those have been a couple of practices. And then honestly, like conversations like this, like I want to find like-minded people who I believe are also pursuing God's heart.
Yeah.
And then they're going to give me perspectives that I don't have. And that's why I love this podcast, this whole idea of unscripted conversations, because these are the conversations that will inspire faith. And so like you have a conversation with somebody and they say something to you. Like I remember you and I sitting by the pool in Phoenix, just talking life and ministry and leadership. And there's just these moments where you'd share things and it would impact me.
Yeah,
and I would be like,
likewise.
Sam, that's an incredible way to think about that. So I don't think we're supposed to do this alone. Like, I think that's the other idea that we can get with sort of like these divine moments or solitude. Like obviously solitude, like it makes sense to be by yourself. It's literally what the word means.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that that's where that stays.
Yeah.
So then I can sit with somebody like you and say, Sam, I feel like God might be speaking this to me. Does that sound insane to you? Or does that sound like that might be God? And you can be a sounding board to me. And again, that could go sideways, I'm sure, but that's why you got to trust the person you're talking to. And so those are just a few quick things that I do that I think have really helped me stay grounded and centered, but have also kept my eyes open to what God might be doing around me.
Fantastic. Those are awesome practices. Man, thank you so much for taking the time to be on here. This has been really, really fun.
Absolutely.
And I feel like I've even been pushed in a few ways that just to be a little bit more mindful of those things. And in solitude, like that's my thing that I've realized. If I don't get it, I get quirky.
Well, I wanted to throw a bonus question in. I want to hear the Sam Krelwitz version.
Sure.
Like what? So talk about that. Like what have you been doing, and what has helped you be able to be just more aware of what God's doing, more aware of what's going on in your own heart? I'd love to hear that. That's
a great question. So I have a few things that I've done always. And because of the circumstances of life right now, I've had to like really push on those things. So for me, if I don't get out and go for a run on a regular basis, right now it's not like 2 times a week. But whenever I do that, there's a certain thing, like about 3/4 of the way through my run, I'll realize, oh man, it'll just kind of naturally happen. I'll just start praying. And like it hits me, and I typically like sort of all the things in my head just because I'm away. I'm doing something that like keeps my body busy. Yeah. And then my mind can start processing and doing its own thing. And like I'll go on a whole run and I'll realize, do I remember half of it because I was thinking the whole time? Like, did I cross roads where cars were coming? Like there are things that happen like that. Yeah. That's awesome. So for me, that's a big thing. Every morning, if our littlest one doesn't wake up too early, I'll sit and literally I have coffee. I do a pour over. And while I'm pouring over, I'll do my reading. Yeah. And it's about the same amount of time to do 3 chapters, Old Testament, Psalms, and New Testament. Yeah. And like that's just what I do. That's my practice every morning. That. And there'll be something in there that always hits me that kind of directs my day. And then the last thing is, I mean, we've just time with my wife always. We just got back from a little bit of time away for our anniversary, 11 years. Pretty fun. Yeah. You guys congrats, similar, man. Yeah, we're getting close. But time with her always does that. Yeah. But really, like for me, and she'll kick me out of the house sometimes and say, just go be by yourself a little bit. My wife does that too. Yeah. And most of the time it's because I'm just trying to like do stuff and I'm not doing it with thoughtfulness. And we're going through some transitions here. So I'll be taking over as lead pastor on January 1. And it's slowly sinking in more and more the degree to which I need to make sure I'm on the right place with God as I lead. And that's become more and more clear. And the distractions thing is a normal thing. So finding space where you can really think and pray and say, hey, God, this is what I think you want us to do. I want you to confirm it for me. Yeah. And feel that certainty. Huge. So, man, what I love about there's 2 things you said in that I think are super important. One is that you said that like there's regular times and places that you do these things. Like everything you just said is not impossible. No. Like while you're making your coffee, boom, that's Bible time. Yeah. And I do something similar when you go running, and I do something similar as well. And so I love that because those are just like you've already found places in your life where you're already doing something. And you go, this is a great place for me to do this practice. Yeah. The other thing is you said, I've been pressing into them more as life has gotten crazier. Yeah, absolutely. Because you have to. Yeah. Because so tell me, why is that important? Well, because what's interesting is when life gets less busy, you tend to slack off, which probably isn't the right thing to do. But you realize when life is full, that you are human and inadequate.
Yeah.
And you need something bigger than yourself.
Yeah, man.
And that's when you have to have the time where you let God show up and take the time to put yourself in a place where he can show up and you'll recognize it.
Yeah.
So that's definitely Lane.
Man, that ministers to me, dude. Like
Awesome.
I listen to that and I go, because life has felt kind of chaotic to me lately. And I've been feeling similar. Like, man, I've got to press in more. I've got to hold on to these practices and these times even more, because if I don't, it's like going underwater and not coming back up for oxygen.
Totally.
It's like you've got to make sure that these things are in place, and they're even more important. And I keep thinking to myself, and I don't think it's going to get easier. It's not like it's going to get less. Like it's going to continue to ramp up. And so even more do I need to take this season to continue to learn these practices and learn how to be like at a sustainable pace, because otherwise, I'm going to be kicking myself a year from now and going, man, why didn't I redeem that time and really make the most of it? And so that just, man, that encourages me a lot. And I'm going to take that with me.
I'm glad we could share this way. This has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming down for this.
Yeah, man, me too.
This has been an awesome conversation. And for those of you who are tuning in, where can you find you? Like, I know that you have the podcast. Just give yourself a little bit. Like, tell me where people can check you out.
Sure, man. As you said, I'm a teaching pastor at Christ the Rock Community Church, and so you can look that up online. And like, we're CTR Online is usually where you can find that. I do have a podcast called This Divine Moment, and like I said, 12 episodes in, and so it's just fun to have people connecting with me, and I've got believers, non-believers, all sorts of people from all walks of life checking it out. And I've got one listener from Germany, which is kind of random, but I'm like, all right, welcome international friends. And then you can, my name is Ben Korinek, Korinek. And if you look that up on any social media platform, I'm there under that name. And I'd love to connect with anybody who wants to connect with me there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all again next week.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Sam.
You bet.